up around. The Telegram, Perfect Day, the Newfoundland and Labrador Teachers Association, and of course the Newfoundland and Labrador Public Libraries who have made this space available to us. Thank you very much. And we also have Long and McQuaid, who's I'll call them our audio sponsor for several of our events. And thank you to Mary Dalton, who hosted our poetry event last week, and to Glenn Deere, who's here hosting this evening, who will be coming up shortly. Administratively, they're hiding, but Wendy Rose, our Member Services Coordinator, and Jen Windsor, who likes to disappear when I want to thank her for stuff. There she is. These guys work quadruple overdrive to get these awards done, so thank you very much, you guys. And the committee members on the Literary Awards Committee, Carolyn Parsons-Chafee, Ray Critch, and Ainsley Hawthorne, whose input into these events over the last few months has been invaluable. Our jurors, of course, are pivotal to making this happen. Thank you to Jenny Higgins, Bill Rowe, Russell Wangerski for your work. You determined our inaugural nonfiction long list, and you had the unenviable task of whittling that long list down to the 3 finalists that you see here today. So thank you. I'm glad that was not me. I trust fully in this man, who it's my pleasure to introduce, to run a seamless operation here this evening, Glenn Deere. Glenn is a former television reporter. He worked in CBC newsrooms in every Atlantic province and spent 2 years in Tokyo with Japan Broadcasting Corporation. After once swearing he would never write a novel because making stuff up is hard work, he used over 3 decades worth of journalistic black humor to write The Money Shot, which was published in 2016. Pursuing The Money Shot once got him arrested. Perhaps you're the only person in the room that applies to. I don't know. That could be a unique thing. His memoir, Sick Joke, Cancer, Japan, and Back Again, was shortlisted for a Newfoundland and Labrador Book Award in 2011. Glenn is a former vice president of the Writers Alliance and former chair of the Atlantic Journalism Awards. And as I invite Glenn to come up here, I very quickly would like to remind you to turn your cell phones off because I forgot to say that at the very beginning of the event. And Glenn, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kelly. As Kelly mentioned, my job is to introduce everyone, so I'm going to jump right to that because time is of the essence. Our first reader tonight is going to be Ann Budgell, and Ann is a former CBC journalist who worked for 35 years in Newfoundland and Labrador. She was the first woman to host the Fisherman's broadcasts, as it was called back then. On television, she anchored Here and Now and On Camera, and then later she returned to radio to host and produce Radio Noon for 12 years. Her nonfiction book, Dear Everybody, A Woman's Journey from Park Avenue to a Labrador Trapline, came out in 2013. Her new book, We All Expected to Die, Spanish Influenza in Labrador, 1918-1919, won the Peter Cashin Prize from Memorial University's Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities. For those of you who haven't read the book, I'll give you a brief description. At the end of World War I, a swiftly killing virus traveled the planet, and up to 100 million people died in the most lethal pandemic in recorded history, the Spanish flu. And nowhere was it more deadly than on the Labrador coast. In the Inuit villages of Ocock and Hebron, the mortality rate was 71%. Anne recreates that nightmarish time using personal memories, diaries, letters, newspapers, company journals, and government and missionary records. The jury had this to say about We All Expected to Die. Ann Budgell has written an extraordinary and essential work. She recounts fully, with an unflinching voice, the appalling impact of the pandemic and the apathy and negligence of official responses. But her story also tells of the courage and fortitude of individual men, women, and children in the face of horrific tragedy. Ladies and gentlemen, Ann Budgell.
I see I'm among my people, the white-headed ones. Gives me a great comfort. Thank you, everybody, very, very much for being here tonight. It's fabulous to see all this interest in nonfiction history, and I'm so pleased to be here with Stan, who wrote a lovely book about an artist that we know and loved, and Vicky, who wrote a book about an artist we didn't know and were delighted to find out about. So I'm very pleased to be here on the panel with them. I'm going to start reading at a point where the Moravian mission vessel, the Harmony, which brought the flu to Labrador, has already been to Hebron. The captain of the vessel, Captain Jackson, decided, because it was his third return trip and the season was getting late, he decided he would leave St. John's, go directly north to Hebron. He wasn't going to do what he normally did, Makkovik, Hopedale, Nain, Bocac, Hebron, because he was afraid of getting stuck in the ice and being there all winter long. So he went straight from St. John's to Hebron. They were in Hebron for a week, and then they left to go to Oaxac. And I'm going to pick up the story where they're leaving Hebron. Leaving Hebron on the 4th of November, Captain Jackson probably reckoned how long it would take to deal with freight when they arrived at Oaxac. The Harmony had spent 8 days in Hebron, counting the side trip to Saglac, probably a day or two longer than he had expected to stay. After just a few hours underway, the ship anchored in the shelter of Oaxac Harbor to the same warm, enthusiastic welcome they had experienced at Hebron. 20-year-old Keturah Pamak Boas heard the gunshots fired by the men who were on the hill watching for the ship. A big commotion always ensued when the ship arrived, when everyone was excited and running to help unload the boat. Small boats were immediately launched. As at Hebron, all freight would be offloaded from the ship at anchor, brought ashore by boat to the wharf, and carried up to the mission house and store by as many willing helpers as possible. In an interview she did as an elder published in 1975, Boas said, "The captain warned the first boat that came out that not too many people should go aboard. He said there was a bad flu going around St. John's and people were dying off." In another interview done a few years later, she said that almost everyone helped unload freight and then load fish, although she added that people later said a man on the ship was sick and the captain had told them not to get on board. Jackson made no note in the ship's log about any sickness on board the Harmony at any point during the 41-day trip from St. John's to Hebron and return to St. John's. More than 2 weeks after leaving St. John's, it is possible that one or more crew members of the Harmony were still carrying and spreading active influenza virus. Every crewman would not have been infected at exactly the same time. Newly infected Inuit passengers may also have boarded the ship in Hebron or Saglac, people from Oaxac who were going home, or Hebron people who wanted to visit friends and family in Oaxac or in Nain. It was the last boat of the year, an opportunity for a comfortable ride for a few hours. Whether the infection was carried by a member of the ship's crew or by Inuit who were infected in Hebron or Saglac, the influenza virus arrived in Oaxac on the 4th of November, 1918, so almost 101 years ago, almost exactly. For the next 3 days, unloading and loading continued. The resident missionaries, Sigmund Baldwin and Herman Asbo, would have been writing letters and finishing reports. The Harmony was sailing directly to London from St. John's, and their mail would be received in England early in the new year, which they considered to be very good time. Jackson was probably relieved that the Harmony's stay in Oaxac was shorter than at Hebron. Perhaps more people were on hand to help with the freight. On the 7th of November, with their work done and everything in readiness to depart the next morning, some members of the ship's crew went ashore for a dance. It would have been held somewhere out of sight of the Moravian missionaries, who strongly disapproved of fraternization and especially dancing. Rosie Pamak Ford, then a little girl of 9, was too young to go to the dance, but she remembered people talking about it. She said, "I know they was ashore that night before they left. The crew, they had a big dance. I can remember that. Heard them talking about it, eh? Spread it good then, I suppose, if they had the sickness at all." About midday on Friday, the 8th of November, 4 days after arriving, the Harmony steamed out of the harbor heading south for Nain. Waldman wrote that he noticed the first sign of sickness in the village on the day the ship left. He reported that a Holy Communion service was held on Sunday, the 10th of November, and he said quite a number of communicants were absent. I had received notice from some of them that they were not feeling well. The day following the service, we found the whole village stricken with an epidemic. In one house, a young married couple, John Gear and Tabia Pamak Gear, were sick, trying to care for their children and each other, and dying in the effort. Many years later, their daughter, Rosie Pamak Ford, told how their mother died with her baby son, Alex, in her arms. I should interject here that I interviewed her for a film that Nigel Markham and I made way back in the late 1970s called The Last Days of Okak. And this clip, it was from the interview that I did with her, so I actually met her. And she said, I called out to her, her mother, and there was no answer. So I went over to her bed and put my hands on her, trying to wake her up. My hand popped back just like something I wasn't expecting, see? Hard body. And my brother was feeding off her, and I went to my stepfather and told him my mother died, and he didn't take a bit of notice of me. He just went off to sleep, like, you know? They had no pain or nothing. I can remember they had a job getting their breaths, bad colds, choked right up, it seemed like. It come on all at once. My mother was only sick a couple of days, and she died, and my father. Rosie's half-sister Maggie Gear Saunders, 5 years old at the time, also recalled the progression from sickness to death happened quickly. And here's what Maggie said. It was a few days after when I remember them saying they were all beginning to get sick. So my father and mother got sick too. And I think it was all right if you didn't go out, but if you went outdoors, that was it. So he went down to the store to get some food for my mother because she was really sick, and he really got sick himself. I remember him lying there on the floor on a mattress, and he was so unconscious. You could move around, and he didn't even know it. Then my mother died, and they took us children. There were 3 of us. There was my sister Rosie, myself, and my baby brother Alex. They took us out of the house and took us to our grandmother's. Our grandmother was down in what you call the village. Okak was segregated. There were people, so-called settlers, and then there were Inuit. It was segregated. She said, my grandmother was down in what you call a village. Her name was Rosina Pamak. I remember that, and we had to stay there. And well, my grandmother had a good house, a warm house. And they put all the children whose parents were dying in that house to keep them together and to look after them. And they were bringing children in all the time because the parents were dying. The missionaries, Waldman Asbo and the storekeeper, Ward, brought people out of houses where the dead outnumbered the living, reserving some houses for bodies. Only a few adults were well enough to do the horrible but necessary work. When done shifting bodies, they were hauling wood and water in extreme cold and wind. Asbo, with 1 year of medical training and 5 years' experience in Labrador, was in charge of the hospital at Okak. He later stated in an affidavit, about the 15th, the first death occurred. Daily afterwards, death continued until about the end of November when the disease had run itself out. At that time, we did not know anything about the people on the outside. He meant the people who had gone to seal hunting camps and islands and places out around. In the statement Waldman gave, he described the sickness as lasting only about a week before people died. We thought it was only ordinary influenza, as we had on various occasions experienced, because on the 12th, some of the natives were moving around again. On the 14th, 4 died, and daily they dropped, and from the 14th to the 22nd, we had 70 deaths. This is in a tiny little village, right? While all adults who were well enough worked in the homes of the sick and dying, dozens of dogs, unfettered and unfed, were marauding around the village. Teams of huskies, work animals kept for hauling sleds, were savage and wild, fighting for whatever they could scavenge to eat, threatening the lives of anyone who dared to go outside. Maggie Saunders said even the children helped to kill the dogs. She said the people had lots of dogs, and the dogs used to break into the houses, you know, and start eating the bodies. And there were dogs running around. I can remember I used to be so frightened. Dogs running around fighting, and I remember them saying there were dogs breaking into the houses where they had bodies. And they were fairly vicious because there wasn't much people left, see? I think there were at least 3 or 4 young men and a few old people. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Ann. Our next reader is Stan Draglin. Stan is Professor Emeritus in the Department of English at Western University. He was founder of Brick Magazine and Brick Books, and he's been a prodigious author. Floating voice, Duncan Campbell Scott and the Literature of Treaty 9 in 1994 won the Gabrielle Waugh Prize for Canadian Literary Criticism. 12 Bars in 2002 was co-winner of the B.P. Nicol Chapbook Award. Apocrypha, Further Journeys 2003 won the Newfoundland and Labrador Rogers Cable Award for nonfiction. That's when we had sponsors, big ticket sponsors. Stormy Weather, Foursomes 2005 was shortlisted for the E.J. Pratt Poetry Award. Strangers and Others, Newfoundland Essays 2015 was shortlisted for the BMO Winterset Award. Strangers and Others 2, The Great Eastern, appeared in 2016. Gerald Squires was published a year later in 2017, and a new book of literary criticism, The Difficult, is just out. Gerald Squires, the book, spans six decades of prolific art production. It features works that have become iconic, but also images that are less well known. Some of those were discovered by Stan in the extensive Squires archive maintained by Gail Squires, Jerry's wife. This richly interpretive essay is shaped by Squires' own poetry, fiction, letters, and essays. And the jury had this to say about Gerald Squires. Stan Draglin's Gerald Squires is delivered in a detailed, precise prose that displays a complicated man, warts and all, in a way that makes even those warts seem something to behold. It could be needlessly academic. It is not. It could easily be overcomplicated. It is not that either. Instead, this is a remarkably honest book written with great love, great care, and great respect for the artist it reveals and explains. And that love and respect shows up on every page. Ladies and gentlemen, Stan Draglin.
Thank you, Glenn. I'd like to thank everybody at WANL for administering this award, the jurors, of course, and my fellow shortlisted authors for the good work that they do. I'd like to read from the last chapter. It's a brief chapter, but don't worry, I won't give anything away. There's an epigraph that I'll have to read you because I riff on it a little bit. This is from James Wood. The curious advantage of being able to survey the span of someone else's life, from start to finish, can seem peremptory, high-handed, forward. Grief doesn't seem entitlement enough for the arrogation of the divine powers of beginning and ending. We are uneasy with such omniscience. We do not possess it with regard to our own lives. Squires read Wood's article. I mentioned above that he wrote down the passage from it about Donne's sermon on the book of Job. Having looked up the source, the New Yorker, I found this other Alpha Omega passage. I had it at the head of this essay until I decided it didn't belong there. I haven't been surveying the whole of Squire's life. That would be biography, a much broader project. I have been reading the life in terms of the writings and the art, and that makes the life look darker than I believe it was led. I've been surprised to find so much of the evidence pointing that way, but there it is, true, I'm pretty sure, but partial. It's important at least to sketch in a few of the lighter times. Like Squires and Roger Aldrich, bored in Corner Brook, commandeering an empty billboard to paint a nude on it. Queried about their activity by the local constabulary, but permitted to continue. Or Squires, Horan, and Waugh, dressed in ski-doo suits to paint outdoors in the winter, sliding a warming bottle of back and forth on the ice between them. Squires says Remy Martin, Horan says Glenfiddich. Probably this is how the Scots invented curling. Or the funny birthday cards for Esther with whom Gail says he shared a sense of humor. One card responds to Esther's 20-something question about the darkness of his work, the gist being, "Why don't you lighten up, Jerry?" It depicts an artist working at his easel/canvas. He is painting a colorful landscape with a huge rainbow arching over it. The rest of the page, the sky, throngs with the penciled faces of ghouls. A couple of them, one has horns, have their fingers on the canvas itself. Skit, the one-eyed family cat who recurs in these cards, looks out at the viewer and points to the artist, saying ambiguously, "Get him." The caption, "I try, Esther, I really do." Or Squire's parody of his party piece, "I Ride in Old Paint." He is in India on the trip during which he wrote to Esther as a character called Jake. Here he seems to be conflating a 10-day Vipassana meditation at Jaipur with friendly resistance to his daughter Miranda's guru, Swami Shyam. Jerry liked Swami and respected his wisdom, said Gale, but wasn't about to give up his own vision for his. This is stanza 1. "So long, old Shyam, I'm leaving Kaloo. I'm off to go Shani just to get away from you. We'll indulge in tobacco. We'll drink our red wine. We'll feed on chapatis and not get in our minds." Or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, names of the 3 kilns in the kiln room of the Squire's studio. In chapter 3 of the book of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are Jews cast into the fiery furnace by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. They have no hurt because a fourth has joined them, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. Here is biblical nomenclature appropriated for the fire of creation, flame of the fourth. In those kilns were formed ceramic tiles representing each of the Greek muses that decorate the fireplace around in the Squire's workroom and library, not to mention various church and hospital commissions, collaborations with Esther and or Gale. Sometimes the joke was on Jerry and richly enjoyed by his family. For instance, in 2003, for instance, Jerry, Gale, and Esther walked to the Camino del Santiago. In a file marked odds and ends, Jerry kept in his and Gale's Credencial del Peregrino, my Spanish, don't have it, Credencial del Peregrino, duly marked with stamps from Roncesvalles to the finish. But of the 3, only Jerry was not awarded his certificate of completion because he told the truth about what he wanted from the experience: to lose weight. Servant of the spirit, Squires, hostage to the flesh. For him, the peregrination was a hike. Yes, there is plenty more to be said. Laced through it all is plenty of humor and great requited love of Squires for his friends and his community, and especially for Gale and his daughters, Miranda and Esther. Working with the trove of material opened to me by Gale, I haven't felt peremptory, high-handed, or forward. It has been a gift, this opportunity to learn more about art I love by a man I loved. Entitlement? I've tried to proceed with a Squires-like humility and have worked to make what I've said as accurate as can be, but I suppose the work of any one person is a self-portrait of sorts. This one, a few strokes only, approaches an end without complaining, without claiming to be finished. In fact, that's a good place to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Our third nominated author is Vicki Sarah Hallett. Dr. Vicki Hallett is an assistant professor in the Department of Gender Studies at Memorial University. She's an interdisciplinary feminist scholar interested in the ways that people and places get written together in life narratives, especially in this place. She's from Mount Pearl and has lived, traveled, and worked all over Canada with stints in Europe, Southeast Asia, and South America. After many years of wandering, Vicki now lives in St. John's with her partner and son. She is currently researching women's experiences in Labrador's floater fishery, and if anyone has any stories about that, she'd love to hear them. She wrote about Phoebe Florence Miller, who was a poet and postmistress who lived in Topsail from 1889 to 1979. Despite her success as a poetic voice in the 1920s and 30s, Miller is an obscure figure for today's readers. Mistress of the Blue Castle brings her life and her contributions to Newfoundland and Labrador culture back into focus. We see her through the lens of her most personal writings, the diaries, journals, poems, and letters that she left behind. The jury had this to say about Mistress of the Blue Castle. Vicki Sarah Hullett has created a compelling and creative